There are a lot of interesting characters in the Bible, a lot of interesting people throughout biblical history, but one of the most interesting and intriguing and memorable characters is Peter, at least in my opinion. And there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, first of all, he was one of Jesus' closest companions. Think about that. God incarnate, one of his best friends. That's an intriguing thought. Peter was a memorable guy, but it wasn't just because he was one of Peter's closest companions. He also, he was a little outspoken, shall we say. Sometimes he put his foot in his mouth. He's kind of relatable in that way, at least for me. He was one of the boldest, one of the bravest, one of the most daring of New Testament characters. He was out there. And he's memorable because of that. Peter, when we look at his life, Peter left a legacy. He left a legacy in the history of Christianity. And this morning, I don't want to get real complicated. I just want to look at three things. I want to look at Peter's legacy through his experiences and through his teaching and writing. And then I want to look at Peter's motivation. That is, I want to look at why he was able to do what he did, teach what he taught, and leave behind the legacy he left behind. I want to look at his motivation. And then finally, I want to look at what that means for us, his legacy and his motivation, and how that can help us today. So first, let's look at Peter's legacy. Peter was on the front lines of the first century movement, the first century church. When we look in Acts, for instance, and we're not going to take the time to read through the book of Acts or the first 10 to 12 chapters of Acts, but when we look at Acts, in Acts chapters 1 through 3, we see Peter being a leader in the early church. And we see him not only doing that, but preaching and teaching constantly. In fact, he got to preach that initial sermon on Pentecost, that famous sermon that we go back to all the time and learn from. He got to preach that. He was preaching from day one. In Acts chapter 4 and 5, we see he and the apostles with him are arrested and rebuked and released and arrested again, and they're beaten, all for the sake of teaching Christ. When we think of Peter, we think of him preaching, we think of him getting arrested and getting beaten here in Acts chapter 4 and 5. But moving forward several chapters, in Acts chapter 10, Peter's the one that gets a vision from God about the gospel not just being in Jerusalem or Judea, but that it was going to go to everybody, regardless of nationality. He says in Acts chapter 10, I understand now that God shows no partiality. And that is when he got to preach to the Gentiles, Acts chapter 10. He got to preach to the Gentiles. Acts chapter 12, James, a fellow apostle, killed. Executed by Herod. And it goes over so well with the people that Peter gets arrested, and he's next. Peter, that close companion of Jesus who preached and was arrested and beaten and arrested again, who got to preach the first gospel sermon after Jesus' ascension, who got to preach to the Gentiles, is on death row. Now, in Acts chapter 12, we know, if we're familiar with the story, that an angel of the Lord comes and rescues him, delivers him from prison, and so he does not end up dying at Herod's hand. But this is Peter's legacy. A legacy of preaching and teaching and persecution and imprisonment and the very risk of death. This is Peter's legacy by what he did. But it's not just his experience that's part of his legacy. His teaching and his writing is a part of his legacy as well. Again, in Acts chapter 2, Peter got to preach the first recorded gospel sermon after Jesus had ascended. What a privilege. And in it, he laid down and put into words some of the foundational tenets and beliefs of Christianity. Did he not? In Acts chapter 2, he says, Jesus was a man attested by God. God in the flesh. He establishes Jesus' humanity. But he also says, Jesus, this same Jesus, was crucified. He really died. But he also says, this same Jesus was raised from the dead and exalted to the right hand of God. The humanity, the deity, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Acts chapter 2 has it all. Peter is laying down the very core, foundational beliefs that we share today. And he says in the end that Jesus is both Lord and Christ. That is, Lord and King. This is Christianity in a nutshell. And Peter gets to be the one to put it into words. He gets to pioneer it. What a privilege. What a legacy that he leaves. This message over the next 2,000 years that he says in Acts chapter 2, it will be lived for, it will be died for. It will be used for good, and it will be abused. This message will be at the center of world history from the time he speaks it in Acts chapter 2 forward. And not just his teaching, but his writing as well. His writing as well is part of his legacy. We know that there are the epistles 1st and 2nd Peter. We don't necessarily, they're not very long, so we don't always spend a lot of time in them. But if we look, for instance, at 1 Peter, in 1 Peter, we have, again, some core principles of Christianity being left behind from this apostle, this companion of Christ. In chapters 1 and 2 of 1 Peter, we see that he says we are called, we have been born anew, this new birth teaching, that we are called to be living stones in the house of God, a term that we use quite often, that we are to be holy, set apart, that we have been chosen by God. Especially 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. He says, I'm sorry, not chapter 2 verse 9. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. That's the issue. I'm in 2 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Read those verses again and think about how many foundational beliefs that we have and hold and are core to who we are and how we act and our relationship with God, our priesthood, our being a people for his possession. These are the teachings that Peter left behind in his writings. And if we continued through the book of 1 Peter, we'd see more. We'd see characteristics of Christians that are essential, that he says are essential, like humility in chapters 2 and 3, and selfless sacrifice, suffering for righteousness in chapter 4, and endurance in the face of temptation in chapter 5. The necessity of resisting the temptations of the devil. These are Peter's writings. So when we look at Peter's legacy, we don't just have the life that he lived, but we have the words that he spoke, the teachings that he left behind, and the things that he wrote to encourage the first century Christians and to challenge the first century Christians. This is Peter's legacy. Peter left a legacy of faith. Of faith. He pioneered and championed the gospel message that Jesus had given him. And he endured imprisonment and persecution, and eventually he, as far as we can tell from history, endured death for the sake of Christ. He spent his life teaching and encouraging others to answer that same call, that call that he talks about in 1 Peter, the call of Christ, the call to humility and sacrifice and endurance. That's how he lived his life. He led, he taught, and he left his teachings and legacy behind. But this makes sense when we look at Peter's motivation. When we look at Peter's motivation, it makes sense because Jesus had commissioned Peter with a task. He had given Peter a job to do. And what I want to do is I want to actually move backwards through Peter's life a little bit. And I want us to look at some interactions between him and Jesus and see two things. One, Peter's commitment to Jesus. And two, what Jesus had Peter do because of his commitment. Peter committed himself to Jesus, and so Jesus said, okay, here's your job. Here's your task. Here's what I want you to do. So turn over to John chapter 21. Again, we're going to be working backwards a little bit here through Peter's life. But in John chapter 21, we are post-resurrection, but before Jesus ascends. So Jesus has already died, been buried, been resurrected, but he has not yet ascended back to heaven. And in John chapter 21, beginning in verse 15, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." This is one of the last interactions between Peter and Jesus. And what Jesus says to Peter is, if you love me, and I know that you love me, take care of and teach my people. No wonder when we get to Acts chapter 1 and 2 and 3, Peter is leading the way he is and teaching the way he is. A resurrected Jesus said to him, "I know you love me, and if you love me, I want you to take care of my people and teach them." It should be no surprise when we get to Acts and Peter leads and teaches the way he does. One of the last things Jesus said to him is, "Do this." And so he does. Because Peter was committed to Christ. And he loved Christ. He loved Jesus. And so he did exactly what Jesus asked him to do in this passage here in John chapter 21. Turn to Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. This is another familiar passage. We've moved backwards in time here a little bit. We're now at the Last Supper. This is before Jesus has been taken to trial, or been tried or been crucified. This is the night of his betrayal. And in Luke chapter 22, begin reading in verse 31. Jesus says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers." Peter said to him, "Lord, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death." Jesus said, "I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me." So Jesus tells Peter, hey, Satan's really out to get you. He really wants to shake you and shake your faith, but I have prayed for you. And Peter's response, in typical Peter fashion, is, well, Jesus, I'm ready to go with you wherever. To prison, to death, it doesn't matter. And Jesus' response is, you're going to deny me. And that's what we normally talk about in this passage. And it's understandable because there's this very strong and needed lesson in Peter's denial. But what I fear we sometimes overlook when we focus on the fact that Jesus tells him he's going to deny him, and then he does deny him, is the level of Peter's commitment here. Peter says to him, I am ready to go to prison and to death with you. And that night in the garden, in the face of an angry mob with Roman soldiers present, he draws a sword. I don't think he planned to live that night. Now Jesus surrenders, and Peter's life is spared in what surely would have been his death. But Peter said, I'm ready to go to prison with you and to die with you. And that night he draws a sword. He was not kidding. Now he goes on to fall. He goes on to fail and deny Jesus. But let us not forget the level of commitment that Peter showed in this moment. And it's interesting, by Jesus surrendering and Peter's life being spared, he still went to prison for Jesus. He still was persecuted for Jesus. And he still died for Jesus. It just didn't happen when he thought it was going to. In the end, Peter made good on his commitment to go with Jesus wherever it required, to prison and to death, despite his moment of weakness that night. Are we starting to see a picture of Peter's motivation and his commitment that drives him to do what he does in the book of Acts and throughout the first century? Turn to Matthew chapter 14. If there's one event, one moment in Peter's life that I feel illustrates, in this concrete illustration, the rest of Peter's life and his work for God, it's going to be here in Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, let's begin reading in verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, that's Jesus, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking out on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, If it is you, command me to come out on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." What a Peter moment. Let me put it that way. Here they are in the middle of a storm. They see Jesus walking on the water, and Peter says, "I want to be out there. Call me out." The Sea of Galilee is just like any other body of water. If a human steps on it, they sink. Peter knows this. He wants to be where Jesus is, even if it is not possible for a human to be there on their own. He says, "Call me out on the water." He commits to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Okay, come." Up till now, it's all been words. And then he steps out of the boat. Talk about commitment. Talk about trust. Peter got to do something that no other man save Jesus had ever done. Because he committed to Jesus and said, "Call me out there. Command me to come. I want to come." A lot of times when we study this, we look at the moment he gets distracted. He sees the waves and the wind, and he begins to sink. There have been plenty of lessons about that. But the moment he starts to sink, his eyes turn back to Jesus. And he says, "Lord, save me." This is Peter. This is Peter in a nutshell. He's not perfect. He fails. He falls. He gets distracted. Jesus describes him as a little faith. But even in that moment, Peter committed to him, trusted him enough to step out of the boat, and even when he began to sink, he knew where to turn his eyes. He knew where to put his trust. His eyes went to Jesus. What we see in Peter, we see a picture of imperfect but total trust. Trust in Jesus, the one who never fails. And when we look at that picture, when we contemplate his example, we have an opportunity to learn from Peter and to live like Peter. And there's 3 ways that I want us to observe from this story how we can do that. The first is that we need to recognize, first off, that we serve the same Jesus. Jesus, the friend of Peter, but also the king of Peter. The man who walked on water in the first century is the same Jesus we serve today. He is the same Jesus who is our king and our brother and our Savior. It's the same Jesus. But what goes along with that, the second thing, is that because it's the same Jesus, we can trust him. We can trust Jesus in the same way that Peter did. Jesus is capable of the same things, the same feats, and the same salvation he was capable of in Peter's life. And so when we look at Peter, being totally committed to Jesus, doing things that would have been impossible without his help, whether it be here in Matthew chapter 14, or whether it be in Acts chapter 2 when he gets up and he speaks and preaches that first gospel lesson. Or in chapters 4 and 5 of Acts when he is beaten and persecuted and imprisoned. And in Acts chapter 12 when he's on death row, he is doing things that he could not do without Jesus. And so, if Peter can trust Jesus, and we serve that same Jesus, we too can trust him. Peter faltered and failed, and we will falter and fail. But Peter's trust always landed on Jesus. Third, we need, like Peter, to fully commit to Jesus. To me, Matthew 14, Peter walking on the water, is this concrete example of how Peter lived his life. First, he asked Jesus for opportunities where success depended on God, not on him. And here in Matthew chapter 14, he says, "Call me out on the water." But then he commits to those opportunities. Remember, Peter stepped out of the boat. He didn't just say, "Okay, great, I believe that you can make me walk on water, but I'm going to stay here where I have a deck and a hole underneath me." He stepped out on the water. In Acts chapter 2, he got up and preached on the day of Pentecost. He told the leaders in Acts chapter 4 and 5, we must obey God rather than men. He accepted God's instruction in Acts chapter 12 that the gospel was for all, and broke the Jewish norm in doing so. He sat in prison. He faced death because he was committed to God. He asked God to work through him. Call me out on the water. And then it doesn't matter what God asked him to do, he committed to the result. He stepped out of the boat. And he, in his commitment to Jesus, was able to trust God to catch him, even when he fell. Lord, save me. Peter's life, and again, I feel this story illustrates it well. Peter's life is characterized by a full commitment to Jesus. We serve the same Jesus. We can trust him just as much as Peter trusted him, to the same extent. And we must fully commit to him. Peter was able to do that, and Jesus was with him. All throughout Acts, all throughout his life, until the day he died, Jesus was with him, was working through him. What an awe-inspiring, life-changing, spirit-lifting fact. Jesus is with his people. Jesus is with us. And that brings comfort, because that means our success in living and teaching the gospel message, in serving his kingdom, the weight of that success does not hang on our shoulders. It does not depend on our skill or our perfection. In other words, we can ask Jesus, we can ask him to challenge us with opportunities where we would alone fail. We can say, call me out. Call me onto the water. and we don't have to depend on our own skill or our own ability. We can trust Jesus to support us in our endeavors for His kingdom when we commit ourselves to Him. We can step out of the boat. And we don't have to depend on ourselves, because even when we're weak and we fail, even in times of little faith, we can turn our eyes to Jesus and we can say, Lord, save me. What an amazing King we have, that we can have this kind of trust and this kind of relationship with Him. And there's no reaction that we can have to this other than praise God. Praise God that we have guidance and mercy and salvation that is beyond our own ability, beyond our own conception and thought, if we fully commit to Christ. You know, Peter said to Jesus, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. He told him that on the night that he was taken and tried. And in the end, Peter lived that out. Not that night, but he did live it out. So the question is, are we ready, able, willing to commit to that extent? Are we willing to step out of the boat and go to Jesus, trusting Him to support us in all we do? It begins with commitment to Him. And after that, who knows what He can accomplish in our lives. If you need help with your commitment, or you want to begin a commitment to Christ, we want to help you this morning, right now. We want to help you step out of the boat. Come down here as we stand and as we sing.